Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. Glad to have you here. Today we are going to be taking a slightly different we're going to be making a slightly different video today. Today we're just going to be going over the stats, how they interact, of how abilities work and magic and types of attacks, and just general notes about units that are helpful for a new player when just starting this wonderful game that I love so much. So I'm just going to start by taking us straight down this kind of this stat block. So starting with armor, we'll actually swap to a different unit here. We're going to take a swordsman here. So we're just looking at his armor. And if you read it, how resistant a unit is to missile fire and melee attacks. So armor will take off a certain percentage of non-armor piercing damage. And how much of a percentage is determined by the amount of armor. So the more armor, the better. One other thing you can get from this stat is this small shield right here. And so if you hover over it, it'll say shielded, and this unit has a shield and will block 35% of all small arms missile fire hitting it from the front. So this means that if I have some handgunners or crossbowmen shooting at this guy, 35% of the shots will be ignored if you're firing in from the front. There also are some silver shields, and I know one unit has them here. Hop over to the Grave Guard, and you see here he has a silver shield, so that means he'll block 55%. So shooting these guys with the silver shields, definitely not worth it. The bronze shields might be. That's really up to you. The next stat is leadership, and so a unit with leadership here, basically you have to inflict leadership penalties greater than that number, in this case 50, to get them to rout off the field. Or in the case of the vampire counts, crumble. So here you can see if leadership is above shattered, then it won't work, but it will cause severe damage to itself. Here leadership is above 0, it's disabled, but if it's not above 0, then it causes damage to self. But in the case of really a lot of the other units, they will just break off the field and run. One thing with leadership is there are these unbreakable units, and these guys will have a green text here that says this unit does not suffer any form of leadership loss and will never rout. So they will fight to the last man. And so that you can kind of find here, and it'll always be up here in this green text. Very easy to see. The next one we're going to do is speed, and this is fairly simple. This is just how fast a unit moves. Yeah, and so we'll look there, 37 there, but we pop on some demigriffs and 76. So just how fast they can kind of get around the battlefield. I did slightly miss some of the information on leadership, so you'll go back. You can inflict leadership damage, essentially, by decreasing the unit's hit points, by rear charging in the back, by surrounding it, essentially, by having these abilities like fear. So there you can see it frightens all enemy units, reducing their leadership when nearby. And here you can see terror as well. So just a bigger effect of fear. And of course, anybody who causes terror and fear is immune to terror and fear. You can also be immune to psychology, which mitigates fear and terror's effects on your units. But so yeah, you can inflict leadership penalties using psychology, using rear charge, using hit point damage, and some things, we'll go to the dwarves here, have the ability to discourage a unit. Here, Goblin Mangonel, so it shoots goblins, and those hit by this target receive a leadership penalty. And so there are just a ton of ways here you can hurt and basically attack your opponent's leadership. One of the best ways is actually with the lore of death magic, and we'll pop in here to this spell browser. This is a great tool if you're learning how to play the game. You can click the spell browser and look through the lores. So here, the lore of death has a lot of abilities that affect leadership. Here you can see you make a unit cause terror. Here you minus 16 leadership, and yeah, so just these two abilities here are great at just attacking your opponent's leadership and forcing them off the field. That's a very great tactic when you're using the vampire counts. But there you can see speed. Speed can be affected if you look over here. We'll go to these guys here. And if you look at this, one of their abilities, Power of the Dragon back, you can see imbued flammable. So when you hit them, you will imbue them with this trait, and it minuses 36% speed. And so these guys, this is unique to this unit here. If we look over at these Slayers, does not have it. So you can see there, this Regiment of Renown is useful because it can do something special like slow the enemies down. And so you can hurt a opponent's speed. A couple of spells that do that actually are the Lore of Life, Awakening of the Wood. You can see minus 50% speed. And if we go over here to the Big Wah, you can see, oh no, it's a little Wah. You can see Gork will fix it, minus 24% speed. So this is a way to kind of attack your opponent. And it has a slight effect on cavalry. The speed that a cavalry is using, or it currently has, helps its damage. So the faster your cavalry is going, the more impact damage you will cause. And so if you can kind of use those speed, you can kind of attack an opponent's speed to make their cavalry charges less effective. Next down the line here is melee attack. And here you can see it's determines the chance of a successful hit on the enemy when the unit is engaged in melee. So this is kind of just how effective are they at hitting the opponent, and how quickly can they deal their weapon strength here. And so their melee attack determines how often their weapon strength will do damage to the opponent. And we'll go over weapon strength later. Melee defense is how much of that melee, how much of a chance you have to be hit when you're in melee. So a unit with high melee defense will be very hard to kill because your melee attacks will be hitting less often. And so then again, just stopping that weapon strength from being applied. There are a couple of different types of attacks. We'll see here. We'll go hop over to the silver bullets. Some attacks are magical, and so magic attacks here can harm units protected from regular physical attacks. So it bypasses your armor and does damage straight to you. One of the primary uses of this is for dealing with ethereal units. So we'll hop over here to the vampire counts. We'll take these hex wraiths. We'll go hop down here, and you can see physical resistance 80%. And so magic attacks would ignore this physical resistance. So where other units would have their damage, their weapon strength reduced by 80%, magical attacks will bypass that completely. So that's just a couple of uses of that's the use of magical attacks. One of the other types of attacks are these flaming attacks. So they deal fire damage, and this is particularly useful against the vampires and the wood elves. You can see here some units do have, especially those with regeneration, which is replenishing hit points of combatants. They will have plus 20% weakness to fire. If you hop over here to the tree men, they will have a weakness of 40% to fire. And so just knowing your opponent and knowing what they can build and what they can bring is very important for 40% damage is nothing to scoff at, so they can really change the outcome of a battle. Bretonia is good at this because you can see they have fire arrow units that you can bring specifically against vampire counts or wood elf units. The other type is poison, so you can have magical attacks, poison attacks, and fire attacks, but poison attacks do this. So you can see it does negative to speed, negative to weapon damage, negative to missile damage, and a vigor loss. And vigor is just how effective you are in combat. If you are active, you have all of your stats as is, but as your units become more and more tired, they will perform less effectively. They will move slower, and they will do less damage, and they will have less melee attack. So you want to keep your troops well rested and walk them when you can. So those are different types of attacks. Actually, some individuals, like say these Grail Knights here, have living saints, and you can find this in the green text above, and they are immune to vigor, so they will have no they will always be active, and they will always have access to all of their stats. They will never be reduced by getting tired or by marching around. So that can be very scary, especially as the game goes on. Your units are tired, theirs are not. It can deal a ton of it can give you a lot of problems, essentially. Over here, speaking of vigor, we can take a look at some of these units here. And you can see here Primal Fury, target, self, duration, always, disabled if leadership is lower than 50%. So until your leadership is lower than 50%, oh, that's not what I wanted. Where is it? Are they no longer immune to vigor? Oh, here, rowdy. So some of these units have rowdy, and it's immune to vigor, and it's only disabled if their leadership is wavering. So as long as they're active and they're winning, they will not be damaged by vigor at all. So that's very, very good, especially on a unit like Centaurs, who are going to be running around the map with their super fast 85 move speed. Yeah, so those are the different types of attacks. Now we're going to kind of break down weapon strength. And so weapon strength is divided into two categories: armor piercing damage and weapon damage. So armor piercing damage is always applied no matter what. You can see it right there. Base damage can be blocked by armor. Base damage just is the regular weapon strength, so the number below it. And that is, in this case, 12. And so a percentage of that will go through and damage the opponent depending on their armor. With a high armor unit like the Dwarves, it will probably be almost none. But with like a low armor unit like Swordsmen, it will probably be most of it, because they only have 30 armor. And the exact percentages I don't know, but in the end it doesn't super matter. You'll be wanting to bring armor piercing against armored units and weapon damage against low armored units. One of the key things here is that armor piercing damage is less effective against unarmored units. So if you look here, it says the damage of armor piercing weapons mostly ignores the armor of the target, making them the ideal choice against heavily armored enemies, what we just talked about. They are often heavier and attack at a slower rate though, making them less efficient against poorly armored targets. So say this Bestigor herd is going to be cutting through some really cheap swordsmen. The Bestigors are going to do really well because their armor piercing damage is always applied, but they have a slower attack animation, and so they won't be as cost effective against a low armored unit as they are against an armored unit. Yeah, so they attack slower, but they hit heavier. Yeah, and that is why they generally cost much more than like these cheaper units here. Next, we'll go into charge bonus, and so this is especially effective on cavalry here. So we'll take a look. You can see 62 charge bonus on this guy, and so charge bonus is if your troops are running and have an attack order on an enemy. They have to have an attack order. they will inflict this charge bonus when they hit the enemy unit. And a couple of things, one of the most important things affecting this is how widespread your line is. The wider your line is, the more charge animations you'll be able to get off on the enemy, and the more charge damage you'll be able to do. But as we talked about before, there are kind of positives and negatives of being spread out and in a more blocky formations. But that's less of an important idea here. Just the more units you have in your front line, the more units can engage on the charge, because there's just more units there in the front, and they'll be able to inflict more charge bonus. So that's why it's kind of nice to have your cavalry spread out pretty wide, so they can, as many of them can get off their huge charge bonus as possible. And while we are here, there are two. Yeah, so we're just gonna leave it at that with charge bonus. There are a couple of important abilities that I wanted to talk about as well. We'll get to those after we deal with one thing I missed with weapon strength. So there's not only armor piercing and weapon damage, there's also bonus versus large and bonus versus infantry. So bonus versus large is a bonus that your troops have when fighting anything that is bigger than a horse. So that means like cavalry and monsters, but it does not mean like wolves and other stuff like that. Those guys will not have that inflicted on them because they are smaller than a cavalry. And so this damage will always be applied. It's essentially armor piercing damage. It is always applied when fighting a horse or a giant or something. So you can see here it almost doubles the damage of the halberdier, which is huge. And that's why you kind of bring these anti-large units against factions that bring lots of large units or lots of cavalry, like Bretonia. Over here we do have our second example here, and that is bonus versus infantry. Bonus versus infantry. And this is always applied when fighting other infantry. So greatswords will do +8 armor piercing damage when fighting against anything in one of these categories here. So it can make them much more cost effective. Yeah. So there are, as I was saying, there are a couple of abilities that I just kind of wanted to show off here, and we'll use Karl Franz to demonstrate. Over here you can see that Karl Franz here has a encourage aura, and so anybody within range of this aura will take the highest leadership buff from, each encourage aura has its own kind of leadership buff. Generals are going to be better than heroes, are going to be better than infantry, but anybody in that range will have that added to their leadership, so they're less likely to rout when they have heroes nearby or lords nearby. One of the other ones here is, we talked about earlier, immunity to psychology. So there you can see fear and terror do not affect him, so it's very important. Another thing I wanted to show is Vanguard Deployment. So that means when you are deploying on the battlefield, you can deploy this unit anywhere, and so this can be used for ambushes and other stuff like that. Very useful, but also can be very risky, because you don't know if the opponent has vanguarded troops, and sometimes you can even deploy on the same exact spot, and that leads to some interesting encounters. Here you can see the range units do have some extra stats here, but they are pretty self-explanatory: ammunition and range. There you can see just, how much they can shoot in one battle, and then also their range. One other really important thing to note is some individuals have this trait called Duelist. And Sigvald the Magnificent is one of these guys. And so this is important because this unit will not have any area of effect animations. Say you're fighting someone like Kolek Suneater here. He's going to drop his hammer on an enemy and hit like, if say he's fighting some greatswords, he's going to hit like 20 of the greatswords with each attack. But someone with the duelist trait might only hit like 1 or 2. They are best used when attacking individual units because they do not have AoE attacks. So there, you're going to only really want to use this guy against individual units, and ideally outside of any troops, so away from your main line or something like that. One other thing is stock. Stock is very important, especially in this meta. There's a ton of units who have it, and that is, this unit can move hidden in any terrain, so no matter where this person is, you cannot see it until it starts shooting at you. And this can be a great way to spring some brutal ambushes on your opponent, and you have to be aware of potential builds that might make use of this for your opponent. And one of the best ways to counter this is to just scout out the enemy before you engage them with flying lords or cavalry. You might get a little bit of shots in, but it's better to know that unit's there than to not. One other thing is, and you can see all of these are up in these green text, so it's very important to kind of just like look through these units and read them. One of the other things here is charge defense. So when standing and bracing against a charge of large enemies, this unit will negate the enemy's charge bonus. So if my unit is completely still, not moving, and this cavalry unit charges in, it'll take that 76 damage, which is very important for cavalry to be cost effective. It'll take that 76 damage and drop it to 0. So that's why these guys are going to be really effective against cavalry and large targets, because they mitigate a ton of the damage that they can deal. What next? So there are some interesting abilities here that are really just bound onto a character. So there's magic and there's bound spells, and so these are spells that don't interact with your pool of magic, essentially. And so they're on a cooldown and can be used as many times as you want. And here you can see this, say, Orion has this ability here called Hawk's Talon, and you can use it whenever it comes up, and it is bound to your hero, not to your magic pool. Couple of, like, they also have units over here with these guys. You can see this Sisters of the Thorn unit has 2 of these abilities, Shield of Thorns and Curse of Anraher. So it can be, you have to be aware of your unit's abilities and how best to use them, and if you want your unit to be cost effective, you want to be using them every time they come off cooldown, because, you know, they don't negatively affect you at all for using them. So if you want your unit to be cost effective, you got to be using them constantly, whenever you can. One other thing that is very important is kind of just weight. So say we pop into Bretonia here, and you'll see this a ton in a lot of my quick battles. I do kind of struggle with this a little bit. Royal Pegasus Knights, they're on like horse-sized creatures. These Hippogriff Knights are on larger griffins. And so every unit has this thing called weight. It's not described anywhere, or it doesn't have a number to it, but weight affects many things. It affects your damage on the charge, how far you can throw enemy units when you charge into them, and secondly, but almost more importantly, how well you can get out of an enemy formation. So this horse will have a really hard time, after it charges in, it'll have a really hard time pushing out back through the troops, so it doesn't die. But a Hippogriff Knight will be able to just kind of like easily push its way out of an enemy formation. And you can see this a ton in a lot of my Empire videos, when my Empire captain gets stuck in a combat, but my general has no problem stepping away from it, essentially, and getting back up in the air. So that is something to be aware of when you're dealing with this kind of stuff. Yeah, and the last thing I wanted to talk about here is magic, and magic is super important in Total War Warhammer. You gotta read all through these spells, and you gotta know what all this does if you want to be able to be using it effectively. So we can just go through here. What's my favorite lore of magic? Lore of life is really big right now, but it doesn't have too much for good examples. We'll go in lore of beasts here. Well, then I only really like Flock of Doom. Well, okay, we'll just do. We're settled big on the big wah. So, here you can see all this stuff is describing these magical abilities. Causes magical damage, strong versus a single combatant. That means you want to be shooting it at heroes or giants or stuff like that. Good against large combatants. There you go. Good from a high angle, so it's better if you're shooting it down. That's just kind of what they're telling you. And poor penetration, that means that this is not going to be good against armored units. So not going to be good against a Ragnarok Spider, but it's going to be very good against, say, a giant with low armor. Over here you can see there's a couple of things. This is one of the best spells here. It's plus 58 attack to everybody in a radius, and you can find that here by looking at this effect range. It'll say 40 meters. Whereas this one, say Fists of Gork, target ally. So here you can see this is a spell you can use on one person, and this is a spell you can use on a ton of people. And you can see duration here, and all sorts of handy information here. One of the most important things is also if you double click a spell, you can turn it into an upgraded spell. And so here you can see it takes a crazy amount of power, especially for a top tier one like this, but you can see it adds these things in blue. Increased explosion area and greater armor piercing damage. So yeah, over here you can see this just extended cast range, so that is much less of an effect on the spell, and therefore it only increases the power cost by 2. But when you do this, it does add this thing called a miscast chance, and that's a 50% chance to deal some hit point damage to your caster. And so if you do this too often, you can really just almost kill your caster for the enemy. So that is something to be aware of. And another thing when you're looking at abilities, especially like abilities that I was describing earlier, we'll hop over here. You can see here, Beloved Son of Bretonnia. And so effect range map wide, so it hits everybody. Duration constant. This is the ability that literally made Bretonnia in one of the earlier updates the best faction in the entire game, because it didn't have this line, disabled if leadership is higher than 50%. So when you have this ability, it's going to be disabled until your general is below 50% leadership. And when that happens, all of your troops will gain this ability. And so yeah, there you can see it has a very specific like purpose and kind of a lore. Here you can say, should the Royarch of Fair Bretonnia fall, then the anger in its knights and small folk shall be fierce. So it's kind of like Bretonnia amping up after they lose their general. So that can be a very interesting ability to bring. One other example is the opposite, is the Bloody Hands. If you pop over to Wurzag, you can see here he has this ability, War Paint of Wurzag. So again, duration constant, target allies in range, effects 12% damage resistance, which is huge. Effect range 40 meters, disabled if engaged in melee. So there you can see it's disabled if he's fighting. So if he's not sitting there dancing and kind of just taking his time, allowing him to concentrate on this ability, he will give this to everybody around him. But the moment he is engaged in combat, this will go away. So just something to be aware of. Make sure you look at your spells and read what they do, and really pay attention to all these kind of like nitpicky details, because they are very important. And one of the best things you can do is just go through these and really learn what does. And if you learn the abilities, and you can know what the opponent's going to bring, and you can know what you can bring to best, win the battle. And here, one of the other important things that I like to just talk about is this this counter in the top right hand corner. I can't show it to you, but it's right here when I open this thing right here. And you can see there 135 seconds. So you can't use this ability till 2 minutes into the game. So this is very important. When you're spending, how much is this? 200 gold, almost the price of an entire unit of goblins on this ability. You can't use it for 2 minutes, and so that can be a big thing, especially early in the game. In your deployment phases, you have to be aware of how soon you want to engage, and what abilities you have. On the other hand, if you know the opponent is bringing Wurzag, and you don't have any cooldown abilities, you want to get into combat as soon as possible to prevent him from just waiting you out and getting this ability for free, essentially. So those are just some things that you can be aware of here, and that's always in that top right hand corner of the box. Here you can see these just buffs. These constant buffs don't have it. One other thing that is important is just summoned units. Just wanted to say one quick thing about summoned units. We'll go in here. Here you can see Raise Dead summons a unit of zombies, but summoned units degrade over time. So if you just kind of move away and run away from them, they'll die on their own, kind of thing. And so that's just why it's very important to know this and kind of understand the magic and understand the tactics involved. If you do have any questions about any of these abilities or stats, feel free to drop a comment in the video. I feel like I know a decent amount about the game, and I can clear up any misunderstandings or confusions that you might have about any of the abilities or the stats or kind of how they interact. So anyways, I thought I'd just drop in this different video with a little bit of stat breakdown and just general Warhammer information. Will be kind of a boring video for the veterans, but this is kind of more for the new guys. And yeah, anyways, thanks for watching, and that's that.